We are living in an uncertain time, as we all know, in which the so-called rise of China looms large as a key driver of rapid change and shifting dynamics of global power and influence. As David Shambaugh states in his book China Goes Global, in 2 decades, China has moved from the periphery to the center of the international system. This development has been cause for a lot of debate and deliberation, and often tinged by a sense of apprehension and nervousness. International relations commentators in the West are particularly concerned about the impact of China's rise on the future of the global order, as it is slowly but surely eating away at the status of the United States as the world's preeminent superpower. Talk among political leaders revolves on how to confront the task of managing China's rise. Newspapers carry headlines such as, "Keeping China's rise peaceful is our biggest geopolitical challenge." At the same time, however, China's ascendancy has also generated much excitement, where China's escalating economic clout is touted as the source of growth for an ailing global economy, the driving promise for future global wealth and prosperity. A recent Business Week special report, for example, simply described China as the land of opportunity. Now, it's not that long ago, really, that America was the land of opportunity. So the rise of China, in short, is a discursive trope that reveals a major obsession of Western observers with the implications of China's increasingly important global role in the 21st century. This preoccupation is shaped by 2 seemingly opposing paradigms: China as threat on the one hand, and China as opportunity on the other. However, as Chang Xin-pan has argued, the threat and opportunity paradigms with regard to China's rise are actually 2 sides of the same discursive framework, which structures current Western desires for knowledge about China, in a bid to overcome a deep uncertainty about what a powerful China on the world stage might bring. And this uncertainty is revealed in the frequency with which the words threat and opportunity are joined in questions raised about China's rise, as in, and you see these headlines often in magazine articles, China, threat or opportunity, or the new China, opportunity or threat, right? So while the threat paradigm tends to emphasize the dangers and risks posed by China's rise, the opportunity paradigm is guided more by the optimistic hope for China's smooth integration in the world economy and global society, ruled and organized on Western terms. And I'm really talking here about Western responses to the rise of China. Whether China is seen as one or the other, however, that is as a threat or as an opportunity, what the 2 paradigms share is the binary construction of a hierarchical relationship between an active Western self on the one hand and China as an objectified other on the other hand. In this context, both the West and China tend to be totalized as homogenized, mutually exclusive wholes. However, as Pan points out, the structuring of Western knowledge production on the template of this binary construct has not resulted in a better understanding of the complex realities of contemporary China. As he observes, and I quote, "Over the years and after so many dedicated conferences, forums and publications about the rise of China, we do not seem to have come any closer to settling the perplexing questions such as what China really is and what its rise means for the rest of the world. As long as knowledge about China is predicated on its unilateral reification as a monolithic other, therefore, we cannot hope to develop more nuanced insights, which, as Pan argued, should be dialogic and mutually responsive, based on a critical self-reflexivity and fully acknowledging the heterogeneous particularities of Chinese agency. Of course, China has long functioned as a prominent other in the Western Orientalist imagination. But the contemporary 21st century context is quite different from earlier historical periods, when the West's relationship to China was characterized by a hierarchy of power and strength in the global order, and a very unambiguous hierarchy. In the 19th century and the early 20th century, China was at the receiving end of European imperialism, which led to its status as a subjugated semi-colonial state. And from the mid-20th century, much of the Western construction of China's otherness was nurtured by the dramatic historical events in that country, which led to a long period of isolation and separate development of the People's Republic of China. In this period, there was an actual divide between China and the West, marked by official ideological difference and almost absolute social and cultural disconnection. Since 1978, however, when Deng Xiaoping opened up China for capitalist development and led its stride into the globalizing economy, relations between China and the West have become much more complicated and multifaceted, and less affected by a one-sided hierarchy of influence. As Daniel Vukovic has argued, the decades since Bretton Woods, that is to say since the mid-1970s, have known a confluence of capital, China, and Sino-Western relations and flows. This confluence has resulted in the emergence of a complexly mixed up, globalized world in which China's otherness can no longer be relegated to a remote space out there, right, contained within an insulated foreign country characterized by absolute difference. Indeed, as I will argue in this paper, what is of particular note in the contemporary condition, and what has not received much attention to date, is the increasing visibility and impact of China within spaces of the West, destabilizing existing social and cultural arrangements within Western nation states and their relationship with China. China's global presence is now pervasive in a wide multiplicity of ways. So, as Chambon notes, and I quote from him, wherever one turns, China is in the news, gobbling up resources, soaking up investment, being the sought-after suitor in global governance and diplomacy, sailing its navy into new waters, broadening its global media exposure and cultural presence, and managing a mega economy that is the engine of global growth. Unquote. All these different activities of China are perceived as threats or as opportunities or as both, depending on the observer's stance. However, the so-called rise of China is not just a macro phenomenon restricted to the field of international relations and the global economy. What I would like to highlight here are the more intricate and intimate implications of China's insertion into everyday local realities within the West. My specific focus will be on that particular urban phenomenon of Chinatown, whose relationship to China's rise is particularly complex, I would argue, and it will be shown how this relationship between Chinatown and the rise of China impinges on shifting entanglements of history, culture, and identity. The question of identity is central here, as it is through an interrogation of identity issues at play that I hope to show some of the multi-layered social and cultural permutations brought about by the global and local changes associated with the rise of China. Of course, I do not conceptualize identity here in an essentialist way. As many cultural theories have elaborated, identity is always relational and in a constant process of becoming, rather than fixed and self-contained. This is particularly so for national and ethnic identities. As Andreas Wimmer has noted, few authors today dare to argue for the givenness, transsituational stability, and deep-rooted character of ethnic cultures and identities. However, such essentialist assumptions are still widespread within discourses of international relations, which are predicated on positing individual nation-states as sovereign actors in the global arena. In talk about the rise of China, therefore, as I have described above, China and the West, or more precisely its constituent nation states, whether it's the United States or France or Britain or Australia and so on, these nation states are placed opposite one another as separate totalized entities. In considering international relations, these nation states tend to be thought of as having self-evident, mutually exclusive national cultures and identities. So just as the United States is American, Britain is British, and Australian is Australian, so China, in this conception, is self-evidently Chinese. One can debate exactly what the content of Chinese identity is, or for that matter, what the content is of American, French, or British, or Australian identity. But the identity category itself is taken for granted as given. Of course China is Chinese, you would say. Now, what is suppressed or ignored in this tautological assumption is that Chineseness is not a self-evident identity with transparent meanings. Chinese national culture or identity is neither static nor pure, homogeneous, and uncontaminated by outside influences. Nor do what we call Chinese cultural characteristics in the form of people, things, or ideas nor do they remain confined within the borders of China itself. Right? They travel, and in the process they interact with other cultural threads originating from elsewhere and become part of the unceasing transnational flow of global culture. This process has greatly intensified, of course, in the past few decades with the rise of neoliberal global capitalism, but it was never non-existent in earlier times. So Marco Polo, he went to China and brought Chinese ideas and things back with him to Europe in the 13th century, while Chinese themselves have over the centuries traveled far and wide beyond the boundaries of their home country, creating dispersed diasporic communities whose nominal Chineseness or Chinese identities are often thoroughly localized. The phenomenon of Chinatowns is particularly relevant here. Areas known as Chinatowns exist throughout the world, though not evidently in China itself. Chinatowns, that is, are generally known as Chinese enclaves outside China, where Chinese immigrants have clustered and created a home away from home. Wherever they are located, Chinatowns have always been considered by locals as quintessentially Chinese, as spatially circumscribed areas in major cities in the West and elsewhere, and they are seen just as areas of otherness from the outside, right? Inhabited by strange, self-enclosed and inward-looking Chinese communities who are holding on to their own cultural traditions in a foreign land. In the Western imagination, Chinatown's presumed Chineseness has long been subject to both fascination and repulsion. These are areas whose identities are constructed as antithetical to the countries within which they are embedded. Thus, in common understandings of the Chinatown in Sydney, the city where I live in Australia, for example, its Australianness tends to be downplayed. Instead, it is the area's Chinese characteristics that are highlighted to stress its exotic difference. In this context, too, then, we are confronted with the captivating tenacity of essentialist Orientalist discourse. Chinatown is Chinese. In this way, the mutually constitutive interdependence and interconnectedness of Chinatown and its metropolitan surroundings tends to be overlooked. Instead, Chinatown is constructed as a bounded space, segregated from the rest of the city, and absolutely different from that rest of the city. Now, it should be pointed out that migrant Chinese themselves have often actively contributed to the Orientalization of Chinatowns. The ubiquitous ornamental gates or archways, which can be found in Chinatowns around the world to mark their boundaries, were often erected by local governments in collaboration with local Chinese communities to highlight the Chineseness of these areas. So you see these kinds of gates in multiple variations throughout the world, right? Now, the first such archway was built in San Francisco's Chinatown as late as 1970 with financial assistance from the Taiwanese government. And since then, all self-respecting cities have rushed to build such archways to demarcate their Chinatowns as essentially Chinese spaces. This is part of an urban development strategy which was widely embraced from the 1970s onwards for Chinatowns throughout the Western world. Together with the gates and other paraphernalia of Chinese culture, such as pagodas, red lanterns, and Chinese gardens, as well as annual Chinese New Year festivals with their dragon and lion dance performances, traditional Chinese opera, and so forth, what has happened is that these areas have become attractions to court tourists into the area, promising visitors a truly Chinese experience. Ironically, however, this purposeful display of Chineseness, generally through the use of highly stereotypical traditional Chinese symbols, took place in a time when these areas had begun to undergo rapid change, as Western societies became more open to racial and ethnic diversity and had adopted visions of multiculturalism. Chinese immigrants and their descendants were more than ever branching out into the suburbs as they increasingly became integrated within the national societies within which they find themselves. There is thus a disjuncture between the construction of Chinatown as essentially Chinese on the one hand and the mix-up hybrid realities that these areas represent on the other. As Erica Allen Kim observes in relation to the Washington, D.C. Chinatown archway, she said, ironically, this archway served as a monumental entrance for an ethnic enclave that lacked both a distinctive Orientalized urban fabric and the Chinese bodies to perform Chinatown for visitors. Its gold-plated, brightly colored schemes and elaborated wood bracketing system contrasted sharply with the low-density, brick Italianate commercial buildings in the area. So in fact, these areas generally are very hybrid also in terms of architecture and the way in which the space has been developed. Similarly, this is the case in Sydney, where the archways bookend Dixon Street, which is the central street in Sydney's Chinatown, and this Chinatown was actually only starting to be called Chinatown in 1980 when these archways were erected. And this is really a street which is lined by 19th century colonial British buildings. Making the area more Chinese then seemed to mean making the area appear more consistent with the architectural motifs and symbols of ancient China, but very much in a stereotypical way. Today, while Sydney's Chinatown continues to host a dense concentration of Chinese businesses, restaurants, grocery and herbal medicine stores, community associations, and so on, it is now a much more diverse area, and its boundaries today are very fluid. Yet, as I will discuss later, there remains a strong desire among some of Chinese, long-time Chinese inhabitants in this area to preserve and underline the precinct's Chinese identity. Now, scholarly analyses of China and those focusing on Chinatown do not usually speak to each other. They tend to belong to quite different fields of specialization. Yeah? The study of China is generally pursued by China specialists working within, for example, area studies framework. And now that China has become a major influence on global affairs, a development captured by the Rise of China phrase, the study of China has become a focal concern in the field of international relations. The study of Chinatowns, on the other hand, especially those in Western cities, tends to be framed within the parameters of ethnic or multicultural studies, combined with the tools of urban studies and cultural geography. Here, the analysis generally remains focused on the local and national frame, concerned with the impact and experience of migration. What I hope has become clear from my discussion so far, however, is that there are strong discursive parallels in the two cases, particularly the tendency to construct Chineseness as other, as absolutely different and as separate from the Western subject. Yeah? This is despite the long history of Sino-Western interactions where ongoing mutual influences and cross-fertilizations have surely generated cultural formations where identities are more porous, plural, and hybrid. And nowhere is this more the case than in diasporic Chinese contexts such as Chinatowns. So I'm considering the rise of China and the evolution of Chinatowns together here, and I hope to clarify what profound impact the rise of China has on both the reality and the idea of Chinatown. It will also highlight how contested Chineseness as a category of identity is in today's global context. So let me illuminate this by looking more closely at what has been happening in Sydney's Chinatown, where I have worked in the last few years conducting research amongst the communities in the area. But in order to understand the Australian context, let me go back a bit to the history of Chinese immigration into Australia since the 19th century. Thousands of Chinese sojourners, mostly from the southern provinces of Guangdong and Fujian, were attracted to the Australian gold fields from the mid-19th century onwards. And of course, as you know, the Chinese migrants were also attracted to the gold fields in the Americas and South Africa and so forth. But these migrants, in the Australian context as elsewhere, were received with pervasive distrust and outright hostility from the Europeans, who resented their different customs and ways of working. So Australian colonial history is littered with widespread violence against Chinese miners in Victoria and New South Wales, and the most infamous instance was the Lambing Flat riots in 1861. Anti-Chinese racism was a driving force in the evolution of colonial society towards nation-state status in 1901, which saw the official installment of the White Australia policy, a key target of which was Chinese immigration. The memory of this history is still an important part of the heritage of Chinese in Australia. Recently, some Chinese Australian community leaders actively sought to mobilize their co-ethnics to campaign for an apology from the Australian government for the legacy of discriminatory policies in the past. This demand for an apology for past racist exclusion is inspired by the examples of other countries such as New Zealand, Canada, and California, where governments have issued apologies to their Chinese populations for discriminatory anti-Chinese policies in the past. For example, the Chinese head tax in Canada or the Chinese Exclusion Act introduced in the United States in 1882. A Chinese Australian community leader, Daphne Lo Kelly, whose grandfather came to Australia more than a century ago, exclaims, comparing the Chinese case with that of the Aborigines in Australia, quote, "Surely we do not have to wait as long as the first citizens of this country, the Aborigines, to get an apology and be recognized for the contributions we have made to the country we call home." Now, I don't wish to get into the complexities of the politics of official apologies here. Suffice it to say that Lo Kelly's intervention is a useful reminder of how the birth of the modern Australian nation state was based on exclusion not just of Aboriginal people, but also of other non-white peoples, especially Asians and Chinese in particular. As the cultural historian Helen Irving puts it, in the example of the Chinaman, Australians believed they had found the starkest example of what Australians were not. In other words, in constructing Australia and China as entirely mutually exclusive imagined communities, the former settler colony resolutely positioned itself as part of the Western world. Right? Australians and Chinese were envisioned as two completely antithetical peoples. And the significance of what somebody like Lo Kelly and many other Chinese in Australia have wanted to be recognized is the legitimacy of their belonging to Australia, that they were Australians as well as Chinese. Now, the White Australia policy, which lasted until the early 1970s, had a profound impact on the sense of identity of Chinese in Australia. In this diasporic context, their Chineseness was, to a significant degree, informed by their historical status as a marginalized minority, an unwanted other. The size of the Chinese population dropped dramatically after the official introduction of the White Australia policy in 1901, from almost 30,000 then to only 6,000 Chinese in 1947. But those Chinese who remained worked very hard in their efforts to claim Australia as their legitimate home against the odds. And Chinatowns were preeminent urban spaces where Chinese immigrants in the West, including in Australia, created places which gave them a safe haven and sense of communal belonging. While these spaces were long despised as ethnic ghettos by white Australians, for Chinese themselves, these urban localities have long functioned as a refuge from the hostile environment of white hegemony. In these spaces, they would no longer be the other, but could be themselves, as Chinese, as Australian, whatever. Now, in our ongoing research in Chinatown in Sydney, me and my colleagues, we interviewed a wide range of locals, including community activists, business owners, restaurant people, real estate agents, bankers, residents, students, visitors, artists, and so on. We spoke with one longtime Chinese community leader, Wing Ki, who said that, and he grew up in Chinatown in the 1940s and 50s, and he said that Chinatown, which at that time was not called Chinatown, it was called Dixon Street, this was a natural place to come to, he said. Yes, it wasn't for the Australian local people, it was for Chinese at that time. It wasn't a place where you'd see many Australian people. Today, however, Chinatown is a very different kind of place. By the 1980s, Australia had declared itself to be a multicultural society where the celebration of cultural diversity had become the preferred official attitude. In this changed historical context, Chinatown was turned into a symbol of difference to be protected rather than censured, revitalized, not left to the leveling forces of assimilation. In other words, Chinatown had become an icon for Australian multiculturalism. The city government saw an opportunity. Oh, by the way, this is some young Chinese in Chinatown in 1955. The city government saw an opportunity to promote the exotic potential of Chinatown in a bid to enhance economic development, often with the agreement of Chinese community members themselves. Chinatown was cleaned up and Dixon Street was converted into a pedestrian mall. The city's Dixon Street planning team proposed the construction of the traditional Chinese archway and the installation of decorative lighting using Chinese-style lanterns to highlight the precinct's Chinese atmosphere. So very much like what happened in other Chinatowns as well. And as elsewhere, local Chinese businesses eagerly made donations to these refurbishments. This marked the beginning of a period where community life became entangled with ethnic commodification. As many ethnic Chinese began to resettle further out of downtown and established what Wei Li calls ethno-burbs, Chinatown became known in the public mind primarily as a restaurant and entertainment sector, a place to go for tourists and visitors to sample some Chinese food and culture, as much as a community haven for local Chinese. To be sure, what has occurred here is not unique, but is an instance of a more general process of marketization of ethnicity and the creation of so-called ethnic precincts in the late 20th century. All around the world, in the Western world, Chinatowns underwent this transformation, where Chineseness became an object of objectification and commodification, which often was also self-commodification. In this way, Chinatown became a cultural attraction where Chineseness becomes a performative act. Wing Ki, for example, now runs walking tours in Sydney's Chinatown, during which he proudly exhibits both his extensive local knowledge of the area and his cultural authenticity as a local, as someone with intimate life experience in the area. In the walking tour, he would show keen visitors around local Chinese shops and buildings, explains basic Chinese traditions such as feng shui or eating with chopsticks, and tells the popular history of the area as a quintessentially Chinese cultural enclave. However, Chinatown's new significance as marketable heritage has coincided with the passing of its role as a homely locus of a tight-knit community, right? So asked whether Chinese still gather together in Chinatown today to meet up, Winky says, "No, it's not happening. In my father's day, most of us were just market gardeners and working laborers with time on our hand, and we would go and drink tea together or go into the little grocery stores in the area where you sat around. Today's generation has a different concept of recreation. They don't meet like we do." In the fluid, cosmopolitan and globalized society of the 21st century, Sydney's Chinatown is increasingly being absorbed into the hurly-burly of the larger global city, and importantly in this process, it has become deeply enmeshed with the consequences of the rise of China. In the 1980s and 90s, real estate agents made a lot of money by selling properties to Hong Kong investors and migrants who were anxious about the Hong Kong handover to China in 1997. But many of these have now sold up and either moved on or moved their assets back to China. The past 10 to 15 years or so has also shown rapid growth and diversification of Asian populations in the Chinatown area. According to the 2011 Australian census, about 64% of the population in the area was born in Asia, so that's not just in China, but in Asia more broadly, which is up from less than 50% in 2001. And the most rapid growth did come from new migrants from the People's Republic of China. Thousands of international students have also come to live in the tower blocks surrounding the core streets of Chinatown, and mainland Chinese are also the biggest buyers of property, not just in Chinatown, but across Sydney and Australia more broadly. So Chinese trade and investment is now Australia's main source of economic growth, and governments are certainly determined to capitalize on this much touted rise of China. So that's how you get programs in China readiness, which is now a mantra for governments and city councils, offering workshops for businesses who wish to skill themselves up to take advantage of the booming Chinese market. Tourism, too, is now overwhelmingly dedicated to capitalizing on the burgeoning market of mainland Chinese tourism. What happened there? That image should have been the cover of the China tourism strategy of the New South Wales government. I'm not sure what happened, but you can see these images speak for themselves, really. In short, from the perspective of government and business, China is all the rage because of the lucrative economic benefits it presents. Here we see the China opportunity paradigm feverishly at work, in an apparent turnaround from a China threat discourse which dominated when Chinese migrants first came to Australia more than 100 years ago. Then they were subject to policies of racial exclusion, as I said, but today they are very obsequiously welcomed, although not unconditionally. In the current neoliberal logic, there is a distinct tendency to reduce the Chinese subject to their economic capacities, whether migrants, tourists, students, businessmen, or investors. Chinese subjects are seen as homo economicus, valued only for their contribution to Australian affluence, not as complex social agents with their own individual subjectivities, motivations, and desires. As such, even in all the upbeat pronouncements about the economic benefits of Chinese investment in Sydney real estate, there is a constant undertone of threat that the Chinese might distort the market, might push house prices up, and so forth. Now, the fast growing presence and influence of Chinese from the People's Republic of China has a marked impact on Chinatown. For example, the area has seen the arrival of many different types of Chinese restaurants, not just the old-style Cantonese restaurants, to cater specifically to the many students from mainland China who have come. There are also a lot of karaoke bars, and we have been told that the clientele is mostly from mainland China. Mandarin is now the most common Chinese language spoken at home in the area, overtaking Cantonese, which was the most common language among older Chinese communities, whose ancestry was, as I said, mostly in Guangdong province. So you can see here that from 2001 to 2011, the Mandarin speakers have increased enormously, whereas Cantonese has been in slow decline. Just like in Hong Kong, local Chinese business now feel the need to learn Mandarin in order to communicate with the mainland Chinese clientele. These local manifestations of the rise of China have also led to some tensions with long-time Chinese Australians. For example, Wing Ki stresses that it is a good thing that the influx of mainland Chinese has brought investment in businesses and properties, but he says, we just find it hard to communicate and cooperate with them. There is then a sense of disconnect between old-time Chinatown locals and newer generations of migrants from China. They certainly do not consider themselves part of one Chinese community. For the newer generations, the history and heritage of Chinatown tends to be irrelevant or unimportant. And for young Chinese in particular, Chinatown is associated primarily with their enjoyment of the extensive choice of Asian foods, entertainment, or pop culture on offer. For older Chinese Australians, however, Chinatown's significance is linked directly to their past lived experience of racism and discrimination, a past in which the enclave provided a refuge from their status as marginalized other. However, although these people have long been seen as the Chinese in Australia, they are now increasingly found to kind of embody an impure and outdated version of Chineseness in the context of a rising China. In this context, more powerful modernist and China-centric notions of Chineseness have come to prominence. What the rise of China has engendered then is the assertion of the mainland as the hegemonic and originary and legitimate source of authentic Chineseness, in relation to which diasporic Chinese identities, who are much more hybridized, are rendered derivative. In this context, there is a real prospect that the legacy of Chinatown's past will gradually fade into oblivion. Older Chinatown locals such as Wing Ki are painfully aware of this, and they are working hard to preserve the heritage and maintain the culture of the old Chinatown. Wing Ki's walking tours are an example of this, as are attempts which are currently at play to set up a community museum to remember the local past. It is interesting, however, that in the telling of this past there is little place for an account of the rise of China. Indeed, the rise to global prominence of China in the 21st century has served to unsettle decade-old local diasporic understandings of Chinese identity, which have tended to derive their meanings more from local experiences than from the distant realities of China, the old ancestral homelands. Today, however, China looms large, and Chinatown, Chineseness is now associated more with global wealth and power, underpinned by the huge economic juggernaut of the People's Republic of China, than with a diasporic community identity, shaped by a history of hardship and racist marginalization. Meanwhile, the future of Chinatowns in the West is uncertain. In the United States, there are reports of the end of Chinatown, as traditional Chinatowns such as those in San Francisco and New York are depopulating, not only because Chinese migrants have moved on to the suburbs, but also because increasing numbers are deciding to actually go back to China to pursue the Chinese dream, inverting the American dream, which brought many migrants to the United States in the past. At the same time, some cities which have done without Chinatown in the past have been keen to erect completely new artificial Chinatowns in response to increased Chinese and Asian immigration. An example is the Las Vegas Chinatown, which prides itself as being the first master-planned Chinatown, built in the late 1990s to capitalize on the cachet of the Chinatown brand, and consisting mainly of large Asian shopping malls and supermarkets. In North Carolina, near the Durham-Raleigh International Airport, the North Carolina Chinatown has recently opened, privately funded by both American and Chinese investors. Initiator Liang Shi, head of the local Chinese Business Association, and who migrated to the United States only 20 years ago, has this to say about this new Chinatown. It doesn't come us through again. What's happened? Such a nice picture. Anyway, we represent the newer generation of Chinese Americans, he says. We've always wanted to change the image of Chinatowns in the minds of Americans. Many of the old, large Chinatowns developed without planning and are dirty and less developed as a result. But China has changed so much in the last decades, and the Chinatown doesn't reflect the image of modern China. We want to create something that reflects the new China, a carefully designed, high-end Chinatown that is truly modern. So, as you see this image, that it's really kind of like a very kind of modern Orientalist, modernist Orientalism that you can see there. Something similar is taking place in the Gold Coast in Australia, which is a city where a Chinatown is being created from scratch since 2011 without any prior history of Chinese or Asian culture or businesses in the designated area. The new precinct, demarcated by 3 brand new archways donated by Chinese sister cities, was established especially to attract Chinese business, investment, and tourism. Now, so we have these brand new Chinatowns, which really are the direct result of a globalized world economy whose spoils are now utterly dependent on projections of a continuing rise of China in economic terms. In these instances of what can be called Orientalist modernism, the idea of Chinatown has evolved in perfect harmony with the rise of China, while ostensibly discarding the historic past, represented by the historical Chinatowns, which are now dismissed as dirty or cheap or backward. But the extinction of the old is not inevitable. Diverse forms of local diasporic Chinese activism can generate quite different trajectories for these old Chinatowns. For example, in Vancouver, Canada, there is an intense debate about the fate of its Chinatown, which is one of the oldest in North America, but whose traditional Cantonese cultural fabric is at risk of disappearing. In this city, which has a strong presence of Hong Kong migrants, the local art gallery recently mounted an exhibition in defense of what is called the Cantosphere, and to protest the ominous signs of Mandarinization of Chinatowns in recent years. That's the quote from the exhibition catalogue. A recent billboard advertising a new condominium development with large letters saying Ni Hao, Mandarin for hello, was seen as a slap in the face of the local Cantonese-speaking community. Meanwhile, in Auckland, New Zealand, a recent proposal to develop a Chinatown in the city has received mixed reactions. Proponents argued that if Auckland wanted to be taken seriously as a world city, it needed a Chinatown. Opponents, however, were uncomfortable with the rehashing of the ethnic enclave idea in a city where Chinese migration is a relatively recent phenomenon. The proposal was given an emphatic thumb down by local Chinese young people who dismissed what they called the Chinatown state of mind as an outdated ethnic ghetto mentality. These young Chinese New Zealanders resisted the confirmation of their minority status as Chinese. These young Chinese New Zealanders resisted the confirmation of their minority status as Chinese, which the creation of a Chinatown would presumably represent. And they say that they prefer to see their city as a hybrid, what they call Asia-Pacifican city, because Auckland, very much at the kind of bottom of the Asia-Pacific region, has a very mixed Asian-Pacific population. So these people really resisted the constraints of kind of the imposition of a Chinese identity, which the creation of a Chinatown would imply. So, in such instances, we can glimpse that the symbolic power of the rise of China is by no means absolute. Thank you.